Hey guys, it's Shaylin and I'm here today with another writing video. Today I've got a really fun craft video for you guys on a topic I'm really excited to discuss, and that is reality in fiction and manipulating reality. This is, I think, a really cool topic, but it's also not one that I see discussed that often, just ever. Like, I don't think I ever had like a lecture on this in university that I can remember, but this is something that I like to play around with a lot in my work, but I think it's really interesting and I also think it's really important, so I just wanted to talk about it today. A lot of this is like my own thoughts and kind of just things that I've picked up. So this video is kind of synthesized from like a lot of things I've picked up, but it's not actually coming from like anything I was explicitly taught. These are mostly real terms, but like I've taken liberties to make this fit together into a theory that makes sense to me. If you know of like articles or books or texts or anything on this, like please leave them below. I've never encountered one, but I find this topic super interesting, so if you know other resources on this, like I'd love to check it out. Basically, reality in fiction is just how close the story is to quote-unquote regular reality. For like a very drastic example, the difference between a contemporary book and a fantasy book. These books are existing in different planes of reality. But there's a lot of gray area in between that can be like really fun to play with. Like, what is reality is like debatable and iffy. Like, not everyone experiences reality the same. Not everyone's perception of what is real is the same. Obviously there are things that come down to like perception, but for example, like there are people who believe in ghosts and there are people who don't believe in ghosts. What is reality? Like, I can't even really define. So I guess like you're always probably just comparing to like your personal experience of what reality is. All this said, I'm gonna start by talking about like some different planes of reality. This is like a scale, kind of sliding scale, but some of them are like, the first one is what I call grounded realism. And this is like, if on a scale of realistic to unrealistic, 10 being completely unrealistic, this is like a 0. So to me, grounded realism is basically realism where there's actually like added emphasis on how realistic it is. It's not sensationalized in any way. Nothing is manipulated for drama. It is as realistic as a piece of fiction can be. There's an emphasis on things like mundane life or the mundanity of life. Nothing is cut or shined up for the sake of the narrative. A great example, I just read the book, oh, I would grab it, but it's in the middle of my stack right here. Real Life by Brandon Taylor, which I would call grounded realism. There's like an emphasis on the pain of day-to-day life and like the pain of being alive, and there are a lot of descriptions of like of day-to-day things, mundane things, daily tasks, these little small details. So I would call that like grounded realism, and the difference between grounded realism and realism can be very subtle. I thought I would draw the distinction here because then moving on we have realism. So this is just like realistic fiction, contemporary fiction. In realistic fiction, I think sometimes the events are more dramatic, more coincidental, more sensational than maybe they are in real life, but it's not to the point that we notice it. It's at a point that we have come to accept is acceptable in fiction, and that fiction to still be called realistic. Ideally, everything feels believable and possible. It doesn't really test our suspension of disbelief, but it doesn't mean that it's not prettied up a little or heightened a little. You can manipulate the events a little bit to make for a better story, but we would still call it realistic. Sometimes like what you would read in like a romance novel or even like a thriller novel is a little outside the bounds of what would normally happen, but we can still call it realism. Then we have high realism. This is a term that I had a fiction professor who introduced me to this, and I found it really interesting, and I love this term. So high realism is basically everything could happen. We're in our reality, but it's heightened. I like to think of this as reality with the saturation turned up. Everything is pushed a little, it's a little more intense or a little more vivid or just a little more of something. I love this plane of reality. I play around in this a lot in my writing. I think it's such a fun spot to be. It's still realistic. People will probably call it realistic. It's pushed a little to that next point of intensity or strangeness while still being in realism. So I find this really, really cool. So now we're getting into non-realism. Now we have surrealism. Surrealism is really hard to define. This is the definition that I found when I Googled it. Surrealism in literature can be defined as an artistic attempt to bridge together reality and the imagination. Surrealists seek to overcome the contradictions of the conscious and unconscious minds by creating unreal or bizarre stories full of juxtapositions. I'm gonna make my own definition of surrealism because that one ain't for me, folks. So to me, surrealism is when you're in an altered or strange reality. So I like to think of it as reality shifted a couple degrees. It could include maybe magical elements, but it could just be tonal. It's our world, kind of, but something is weird or off or altered or strange or uncomfortable. And sometimes this is subtle and sometimes it's more overt, depending on maybe how many degrees you've shifted reality. You know, like there are things that don't act as we know them to act. People maybe don't act always how we would expect or know people to act. Definitionally, it's supposed to be that the focus is on like the subconscious mind. That's not necessarily how I'm using it for the sake of this video or when I think of it. I kind of think of surreal fiction as being reality but off. So after that we have magical realism or fabulism. So as I'm aware, the term magical realism originates in the Latin American tradition, and so it's only supposed to be used by people who are like writing informed by that heritage, and that the term to use if your writing is not informed by that heritage is fabulism, is what I've heard. However, I've also seen fabulism just defined differently. Like I've seen it defined as like a subset of magical realism, where like the world is blending with like myth or fable or something. So I don't really know what the distinctions here are, but I have heard and been told that I should be using the term fabulism. So I'm gonna use fabulism. If I slip up and say magical realism, it's because I feel like that's the more common term. Fabulism is basically where we're in reality, but we have magical elements that are integrated as if they are part of reality. They're usually not acknowledged as magical, so like the magic isn't part of a system. It's not like in fantasy where like you have a magical system. In fabulism, it's like here's reality with added in magical elements, but we treat them as if they're just a part of reality. So like magic is kind of seen as ordinary. Characters might do or encounter or engage with magical things and not acknowledge that it's magical. It's kind of like reality, but the rules of reality are shifted a little to kind of like accommodate or like mold around some unreal or magical elements. The magic's not explained usually, like there's no system or reason behind it typically, but it's often symbolic. And again, it's similar to surrealism. It can be very subtle or it can be very overt. And I will say, I think the line between fabulism and surrealism is like so fine sometimes and hard to draw. Like if you just Google the two things like I did when I was prepping for this video and read the definitions, your brain will melt unless you're smarter than me. But if you're on the same stupid brain level as me, you'll be like, what? Maybe this isn't the official difference, but I'm gonna draw the difference here as surrealism is where reality is a few degrees off, and magical realism is where we're in reality, but it has magical elements. But I think like you could probably combine them. My brain is melting. Help. All right, so now let's get into the fantasy. So we've got low fantasy, often confused with fabulism because on paper they look very similar, but in application they are really, really different. This is where we have magical elements in a realistic setting, just like with fabulism, but the magical elements are addressed as magical, rather than being absorbed by realism. There's like a magical system or society that exists within our regular reality, rather than just being a part of it inherently. I don't know, maybe you could say that things like paranormal or like supernatural are maybe like there's magic within our reality, it is addressed as other, but it doesn't have a system, and low fantasy is where it does have a system. Maybe would be a way to define the difference between those genres. So again, the line between this and fabulism can be really hard to draw and understand for some people because on paper they look super similar. They're both magical elements within reality, but how it's handled is super different. So a way to explain this, you could have a low fantasy book about werewolves. Urban fantasy is like usually a type of low fantasy. So you could have a book about werewolves and there would be like a system to that and it would be acknowledged as other. Whereas maybe you were writing a fabulous story where the main character turns into a wolf at the end and like runs away into the woods. That would be fabulism. How the logic is handled is a little different. The fabulism doesn't need to justify it logically, it only needs to justify it symbolically, whereas the low fantasy does need to create its own like system of logic. And then finally we've got high fantasy on the far end, where I think this one's pretty easy. High fantasy is like, it's just explicitly not of our world, it's in a different world. Maybe in between low fantasy and high fantasy there's like alternate reality, maybe? But what's the difference between alternate reality and surrealism? Raise your hand if your brain hurts. I need to take just like 5 seconds. to myself before I have an aneurysm. I thought this made sense to me until I started talking about it. Now that we've talked about that, what can affect realism? How do you shift where your story is? First of all, it's just concept. Obviously, like, if your concept involves magical elements, it's gonna put you on a different plane of realism. Second of all is world building. Again, like, how you handle the world building can affect the level of realism. How systematic you make the magical elements and the way you handle the internal logic can shift it from something like fabulism to something like low fantasy. So how you set up your world and how you set up those systems. Also, writing style. Okay, guess what? I have written stuff that is like fabulous before. I really like doing that. But I've also written a lot of stuff that's realism or maybe like high realism. Pretty much every single workshop I ever had in university, someone at some point or the professor would refer to my piece as being magical realism. Even when it wasn't, even when there was like nothing unrealistic about it, even like the most like realistic stories I've written still get labeled as being magical realism because I realized it's my writing style. I just have this like over the top writing style that's like pretty floral and magical, kind of, that everything I write, even if it's realistic, gets seen as unrealistic. So that made me realize that writing style itself can play a large part. You want your writing style to kind of be in tune and synchronous with the level of reality, you know, like heightening your imagery to that next plane of weirdness can kind of shift how people interpret reality. Even the details you choose. So for a great example, a little while ago, I was out for a walk. In my neighborhood, people paint the telephone poles. It's just like a thing, I don't know, some of them have like clouds, some of them have birds, some of them have like pride flags, some of them have like cute sayings. So I was walking by one of these signposts, so it's normal to have the signposts be like jazzed up a little. And someone had nailed a doll. I took a picture of it. I will insert it if I still have it, if I can find it. Had nailed a creepy doll to the signpost, and I was like, that's freaky. That's the kind of detail where if you read it in a story, it would start to push it into like high realism or surrealism just from the detail choice, because it's not a detail that feels realistic, even though like it happened in reality. I don't know, sometimes reality feels unrealistic, especially when it gets hyper specific. So yeah, imagery and details are a great cue and a great way to cue the reader to how realistic the story is, especially if you're in that zone, that gray area where it's like kind of realistic but not, like the surrealism, high realism. A great way to cue the reader and also like welcome the reader into that plane of reality is by choosing details and imagery that reflect that. Names also can be a great cue. This is a rule I like to follow for myself. The weirder the story and the weirder the reality, the weirder the names. So if I want the story to be a little unbelievable, I pick really weird names. Like I'll choose like more whimsical names for like a more whimsical story, or I'll choose names that like aren't actually names, like naming the characters like a color or an inanimate object, something that kind of is a cue like, oh, maybe we're not in reality because all the characters' names are not necessarily like normal. That's a good way to instantly cue the reader, I think, especially if it's a pattern. And also just like the characters' personalities and actions. Sometimes you get into surreal fiction and people don't act how people act. And I think this is interesting because I think there's almost a blip. People act realistically in realism and they start to act less realistically in high realism, and they can act less realistically in surrealism or fabulism. And then in low fantasy, they act real again. And then they have to act realistically again. There's like this blip in the middle where reality is shifting. Because, you know, there's that difference in low fantasy, we're actually in reality but with a separate magical system. So people have to act more realistically for like our suspension of disbelief. But in something like surrealism, all of reality is shifted. So sometimes people act weird and they don't act as you'd expect them to act. So heightened or strange character actions, or even personalities, like weird character traits or quirks, can be a cue to that. Tone also, affecting tone and atmosphere. I've got a video, it's kind of old, but I stand by the points on tone and atmosphere that you can check out. You know, if it's gonna be unreal and strange and freaky, like you can elicit that through just the tone. All of those things can act independently, all the things I just listed, of the inclusion of actual magic. It's more than just, here's an unrealistic element, like I threw in a vampire. All of these things can create surrealism or alter reality independent of that. So What's key is that it's consistent and that you know what the level of reality is doing. Know where you want your story to be in terms of reality and what that's doing for the story. Non-reality has to contribute something. For example, if people act unrealistically unintentionally, it feels like bad writing. But if people act unrealistically in a way that's done with consistency and intention, then it can just become a part of the story's reality and it can become really, really fascinating. Similarly, if something happens that is unbelievable or illogical in an otherwise realistic story, then again, it feels like a plot hole or you can't suspend your disbelief. But if it's done consistently and intentionally within the plane of reality of the story can accommodate that and it doesn't feel jarring, it feels purposeful, and it adds to what the story's trying to accomplish. One book that plays with reality in a really fascinating way is You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine by Alexander Kleeman. This book plays with, I'd say, surrealism. Reality is a little off in a fascinating way. People don't really act how people act, but because it's done intentionally and consistently, it really is effective here. Another good example, I've got, it's in the pile. I'm not gonna get it because it's in the pile. My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Tessa Moshfegh. That's a book that I would say plays around in kind of multiple ways with high realism and surrealism, because we have this like surreal concept about a woman trying to sleep for a year, but the story approaches it as if it were realism. Because of the dreamy tone, it feels kind of high realism. I don't know exactly where I'd place it. I didn't really pick out examples for this video because sometimes it's hard to place. Books can play with this really complexly and it can just be really complex, and I don't want to like have this scale that I've created and try to put books on the scale because I don't know if I can accurately do that. I think it's too debatable. Know what you're intending with your own work. So that's all I have to say on reality in fiction. Hope that this was insightful or interesting or whatever, because I find this topic really fun. Thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always send me an ask on Tumblr, and I will see you in another video.